She had everything people dream of escaping to: fame, wealth, desire, power. Yet Marilyn Monroe spent her entire adult life trying to escape something invisible and never succeeded. The irony is brutal. The woman the world believed was free was one of the most trapped human beings of the 20th century. By the time Marilyn understood that Hollywood was a cage, the door had already locked behind her. It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen with contracts or cameras or crowds. It happened quietly long before the fame, when Norma Jean learned a single, devastating lesson as a child. Survival depended on being wanted. That lesson never left her. From the beginning, escape was never about geography. It wasn't about leaving Los Angeles or quitting films or disappearing from public life. Escape meant becoming someone who could not be abandoned, someone too valuable to discard, someone the world would never leave behind. That someone was Marilyn Monroe. But Marilyn was not freedom. Marilyn was armor. Every step that looked like liberation was actually another layer of dependence. Each opportunity tightened the net. Each success removed an exit. When Marilyn signed her early contracts, she believed they were ladders. In reality, they were anchors. The studios didn't just own her image, they controlled her schedule, her body, her public identity. The blonde persona was not a suggestion, it was an expectation. Deviation was punished. Resistance was labeled instability. Hollywood didn't tell her she was trapped. It told her she was lucky. And Marilyn believed it, because she had been taught that being chosen was the same as being safe. But safety built on performance is fragile. It collapses the moment performance falters. As her fame grew, so did the stakes. There was no version of Marilyn Monroe allowed to be ordinary, exhausted, uncertain, or private. Every attempt to slow down was interpreted as failure. Every request for space was framed as weakness. The system had no tolerance for retreat. Escape requires rest. Marilyn was never allowed rest. When she tried to escape through love, the pattern repeated. Relationships were never sanctuaries, they were extensions of the same trap. Men didn't fall in love with Norma Jean. They fell in love with the idea of Marilyn, and ideas don't protect you, they consume you. Each relationship promised rescue. None offered refuge. Marriage didn't free her. It complicated her captivity. Husbands wanted ownership, not escape. Stability came with conditions. Expectations replaced affection. Control replaced care. She wasn't choosing partners freely. She was choosing survival strategies. Even attempts at intellectual escape failed. When Marilyn pursued education, therapy, art, and seriousness, the world resisted. Intelligence threatened the mythology. Complexity weakened the brand. Growth endangered profitability. So she was pulled back. Escape also requires permission to change. Marilyn was denied that permission repeatedly. The industry that created her could not allow her to evolve without risking collapse. A changed Marilyn was a dangerous Marilyn. She was profitable exactly as she was broken. The most devastating trap was psychological. Over time, Marilyn internalized the belief that escape was betrayal. Leaving meant ingratitude. Saying no meant disloyalty. Rest meant laziness. Collapse meant failure. She policed herself better than any studio ever could. Even when doors appeared to open, new contracts, independent production, creative control, the invisible barriers remained. Freedom on paper did not translate to freedom in reality. The expectations followed her. The scrutiny intensified. The pressure multiplied. You can't escape a system that lives inside you. By the early 1960s, Marilyn no longer needed to be restrained. She self-corrected. She self-doubted. She self-blamed. The idea of leaving everything behind felt less like liberation and more like annihilation. Who would she be without Marilyn Monroe? The question terrified her more than captivity. Escape would have required something the world never gave her. Permission to be unremarkable, to heal slowly, to exist without applause. And the tragedy is this: Marilyn did try to escape, repeatedly, quietly, desperately. But every path out required abandoning the one identity that kept her alive. So she stayed. Not because she wanted to, but because leaving felt like disappearing. And disappearing had once nearly killed Norma Jean. By the time Marilyn Monroe recognized that escape required more than distance, the machinery around her had already learned how to function without her consent. What had once been external pressure slowly transformed into an internal prison, one reinforced by fear, obligation, and the irreversible cost of leaving. The first wall she hit was economic, though it was disguised as opportunity. Marilyn's income was immense by ordinary standards, but it was never truly hers. Contracts, penalties, suspensions, and uncooperative clauses ensured that freedom always came with financial threat. Walking away was not just emotional suicide, it was economic annihilation. The system made sure she understood this without ever stating it directly. Every delay cost money. Every refusal triggered consequences. Every boundary became a liability. Escape was priced deliberately beyond reach. Even when Marilyn formed her own production company, a move often cited as evidence of independence, the reality was far less triumphant. Independence came with isolation. Studios withdrew support quietly. Cooperation evaporated. Resources dried up. Creative control invited retaliation. The industry tolerated ambition only when it remained symbolic. Real autonomy was punished. This punishment was subtle but effective. Projects stalled. Negotiations dragged. Pressure mounted. Marilyn was left carrying responsibility without infrastructure. The stress intensified her anxiety, which was then used as proof that she was incapable of independence. The trap closed from both sides. At the same time, public perception hardened. Marilyn was no longer just an actress, she was a public property. Millions felt entitled to her presence, her availability, her smile. The audience didn't want her free. They wanted her consistent, familiar, predictable. Escape would have meant disappointing everyone. The cost of disappointment was unbearable for someone whose entire sense of safety depended on approval. Marilyn did not crave attention because she was shallow. She needed it because absence felt like abandonment. Silence felt like erasure. Fame replaced family. Applause replaced love. And like all unstable substitutes, it demanded constant replenishment. Another wall rose in the form of narrative. By the late 1950s, Marilyn was no longer allowed to redefine herself. Stories about her had already been written by others, unstable, unreliable, difficult, fragile. These narratives became weapons. Any attempt to assert control was filtered through them. If she demanded respect, she was difficult. If she slowed down, she was unstable. If she resisted, she was ungrateful. Escape requires credibility. Marilyn had been stripped of it. Therapy, which should have been a path toward liberation, became another containment tool. Instead of empowering autonomy, it often reinforced dependence. Treatment focused on managing symptoms rather than dismantling the conditions causing them. Emotional pain was pathologized rather than contextualized. The question was never why she felt trapped. The question was how to make her function anyway. Her personal life offered no refuge. Friends relied on her status. Partners benefited from her image. Even those who cared for her were entangled in the system that profited from her existence. Support was conditional. Presence was transactional. There was no neutral ground. As Marilyn aged, escape became harder still. Hollywood's tolerance for female vulnerability decreased with time. Youth was currency. Decline was threat. Reinvention was risky. The industry preferred nostalgia over growth. Marilyn was expected to remain frozen at her peak. Escape would have meant aging without protection. The fear of being discarded returned, louder than ever. The orphaned child resurfaced, terrified that without usefulness, love would vanish. That fear made endurance seem safer than freedom. Her body began to register the cost. Exhaustion deepened. Anxiety intensified. Sleep fractured. Each symptom reinforced the belief that she was incapable of surviving without structure. The very damage caused by captivity was used as evidence that she needed it. This is how systems prevent escape. They injure, then claim to be the cure. By this stage, Marilyn's identity had split irreversibly. Norma Jean represented vulnerability, uncertainty, and need. Marilyn Monroe represented survival, performance, and control. Escaping Marilyn meant exposing Norma Jean. That exposure felt fatal. The public demanded Marilyn. The industry demanded Marilyn. The press demanded Marilyn. And Marilyn herself believed that Norma Jean could not survive alone. So she stayed inside the role, even as it hollowed her out. There were moments when escape appeared within reach. Brief pauses, short retreats, glimpses of another life. But each time fear intervened, the fear of irrelevance, the fear of invisibility, the fear of being forgotten. For someone whose earliest trauma was abandonment, forgetting was the ultimate threat. The final wall was existential. Marilyn no longer knew who she would be without the machine. Identity had fused with captivity. Escape required a self she had never been allowed to build. Freedom demands a foundation. Marilyn was never given one. Instead, she was taught to perform resilience, to monetize pain, to transform vulnerability into spectacle. The world celebrated her survival while quietly ensuring she could never stop surviving. This is why escape never happened. Not because Marilyn lacked courage. Not because she lacked intelligence. But because every route out demanded something she did not possess: unconditional safety. And without safety, freedom feels indistinguishable from death. By the time the walls fully closed, escape was no longer a choice. It was a theoretical concept, discussed but unreachable. Marilyn Monroe continued moving forward because standing still meant collapse. And collapsing meant disappearing. By the final phase of Marilyn Monroe's life, escape was no longer blocked by fear alone. It was blocked by architecture. The systems surrounding her had evolved into something self-sustaining, something that no longer required her participation to function. Even if she stopped running, the machinery would keep moving. This is the moment most biographies fail to capture, when captivity stops feeling like pressure and starts feeling like gravity. Marilyn no longer needed to be forced to comply. Compliance had become automatic. The habits of survival were embedded in her nervous system. Every decision was filtered through risk assessment. Every desire was weighed against consequence. Freedom, once imagined as relief, now appeared as exposure. Exposure was unbearable. The industry had grown skilled at manufacturing dependency without appearing coercive. Marilyn's career was structured around artificial urgency. Films were scheduled tightly, contracts layered with penalties, expectations framed as privileges. The pace never slowed long enough for reflection. Reflection invites resistance. She was always behind, always catching up, always apologizing. This constant state of deficit created exhaustion, and exhaustion kills rebellion. When a person is depleted, survival replaces imagination. Escape requires vision. Marilyn was too tired to see beyond the next obligation. Her public image intensified the trap. The more fragile she appeared, the more aggressively the system intervened. Doctors, handlers, executives, publicists, friends, each justified involvement as protection. In reality, protection became surveillance. Concern became control. The language was always gentle. The effect was not. The world believed Marilyn was being helped. Few noticed that help arrived with conditions. Assistance required compliance. Support demanded obedience. Care was contingent on usefulness. If she performed, she was supported. If she struggled, she was corrected. If she resisted, she was isolated. Isolation is the most effective weapon against escape. As her reliability was questioned publicly, her autonomy shrank privately. Decisions were made on her behalf. Schedules were arranged without consultation. Her body was regulated, her emotions managed, her behavior monitored. She was treated less like a person and more like a volatile asset. And assets do not escape, they are contained. The most devastating barrier was the erosion of trust in her own perception. Over time, Marilyn was taught, subtly but consistently, that her instincts were unreliable. When she felt overwhelmed, she was told she was dramatic. When she sensed danger, she was told she was paranoid. When she questioned motives, she was told she was unstable. Gaslighting does not need intent to be effective. Repetition is enough. Eventually, Marilyn stopped trusting her internal signals. Doubt replaced intuition. Confusion replaced certainty. When escape requires conviction, doubt is fatal. Her attempts to assert independence were reframed as evidence of instability. Any boundary became a symptom. Any refusal became pathology. Resistance was medicalized. This ensured that escape appeared irresponsible. The world also refused to imagine Marilyn outside her suffering. Pain had become part of her brand. Her vulnerability generated sympathy, headlines, fascination. Healing would have disrupted the narrative. Stability would have made her ordinary. Ordinary was unacceptable. As a result, Marilyn was never allowed to fully recover. Moments of improvement were met with increased demands. Rest was temporary. Recovery was interrupted. The cycle resumed before strength could return. The system did not want her well. It wanted her functional. Functionality is not freedom. By this point, escape would have required dismantling multiple interconnected systems simultaneously: professional, medical, financial, psychological, and cultural. No single action could break the chain. Leaving one structure triggered retaliation from another. If she withdrew from films, financial pressure intensified. If she questioned doctors, authority tightened. If she sought privacy, the press escalated. If she sought love, dependency followed. Every exit was guarded. Marilyn's internal world mirrored the external one. She had been performing versions of herself for so long that authenticity felt dangerous. The private self had no rehearsal, no script, no applause. To step outside, the role meant facing uncertainty without armor. She had survived chaos before, but always by adapting to expectations. Escape demanded the opposite, rejecting them. That kind of rupture requires a sense of inherent worth independent of performance. Marilyn never had the chance to develop that. Her childhood taught her that love was conditional, temporary, and earned through compliance. Hollywood reinforced the lesson at scale. The pattern became destiny. As time passed, the possibility of escape shifted from improbable to unthinkable. Not because she didn't want it, but because she could no longer conceptualize life beyond the machine. The future felt blank, undefined, unsafe. Known suffering felt safer than unknown peace. The loneliness deepened. Surrounded by people, she remained fundamentally unseen. Being watched is not the same as being understood. Attention without connection amplifies isolation. Isolation breeds despair. Despair narrowed her focus further. Survival shrank to managing the present moment. The future became abstract. Planning required hope. Hope requires belief that change is possible. Belief had been systematically dismantled. The cruelest aspect of her captivity was that from the outside, escape looked available. Fame implies mobility. Wealth suggests options. Power appears transferable. But Marilyn's resources were bound to her compliance. They could be withdrawn, redirected, weaponized. She was rich but not free, famous but not autonomous, powerful but not protected. This contradiction eroded her sense of reality. At this stage, escape no longer failed because of barriers. It failed because the cost of attempting it felt greater than the cost of staying. The system had calibrated suffering to remain tolerable, survivable, normalized. Not lethal, just endless. Endurance became her identity. The tragedy is that Marilyn's captivity was not unique. It was exemplary. She represented the logical endpoint of a culture that commodifies vulnerability, rewards self-sacrifice, and punishes refusal. Her inability to escape was not a personal failure. It was a structural outcome. By the time the final doors closed, they did not slam. They sealed quietly. No alarms, no confrontation, just the slow realization that there was nowhere left to go. Escape requires more than desire. It requires support. It requires permission. It requires safety. Marilyn had none of these. And so, she remained inside the role that kept her alive while slowly destroying her. Not because she chose captivity, but because captivity had been engineered to look like survival. In the end, escape did not fail because Marilyn Monroe stopped trying. It failed because the concept itself had been hollowed out. What remained was a body moving through obligations, a mind negotiating survival, and a world that had already decided her limits. The final illusion to collapse was the idea that there would be a moment, one decisive break, one brave choice, one dramatic exit, that would free her. That moment never came because systems like the one surrounding Marilyn do not end with explosions. They end with exhaustion. By the last year of her life, Marilyn's days were no longer organized around ambition or hope. They were organized around containment. Keeping things from getting worse became the primary objective. Stability, even artificial, was treated as success. Progress was too dangerous to attempt. Escape requires momentum. Marilyn had none left. Every part of her life was now reactive. She responded to pressures rather than initiating change. The future was no longer a destination, it was a threat to be managed. Plans were tentative. Commitments felt heavy. Possibility carried risk. Risk had become unbearable. Her body reflected this stasis. Chronic fatigue, disrupted sleep, and emotional volatility were not signs of weakness. They were the physiological cost of prolonged captivity. A nervous system cannot remain in survival mode indefinitely without breaking down. And yet, even as her strength faded, expectations did not. The world continued to demand performance from someone who no longer had reserves. Compassion remained conditional. Understanding remained superficial. She was allowed to struggle, but only in ways that did not disrupt the machine. The final barrier to escape was grief. Grief for the life she never had, the self she never became, the freedom that was always postponed. That grief had no outlet. There was no space to mourn what had been taken because acknowledging loss would have required admitting that something was wrong. And nothing was allowed to be wrong. As her isolation deepened, the narrative around her hardened. Stories reduced her complexity to fragility. Her suffering became shorthand. The more she disappeared internally, the more the world insisted it knew her. Being misunderstood at scale is its own form of imprisonment. At this point, escape would have required a total rupture, abandoning identity, income, recognition, and the only framework through which she had ever received care. It would have meant stepping into obscurity without preparation, support, or protection. For someone whose earliest trauma was abandonment, that leap was not freedom. It was annihilation. So she remained where she was, not because she believed it was safe, but because it was familiar. Familiar pain is easier to endure than unfamiliar peace. The human mind will choose predictability over possibility when the cost of failure feels terminal. Marilyn's tragedy was not that she stayed. It was that she was never given a viable alternative. The world often asks why she didn't leave, why she didn't disappear, why she didn't start over somewhere else. These questions assume escape was an open door. It was. It was a hallway that narrowed with every step, lined with obligations, fears, and invisible consequences. By the time the hallway ended, there was no door at all. What makes her story enduring is not the spectacle of her suffering, but the precision with which it was engineered. Marilyn Monroe became trapped not by one person, one choice, or one flaw, but by an entire culture that confused access with care and control with love. She was told she was free because she was famous. She was told she was powerful because she was desired. She was told she was lucky because she was visible. None of these things are freedom. Freedom requires the ability to stop, to rest, to change, to be ordinary without punishment. Marilyn was denied all of it. In the end, she did not fail to escape because she lacked courage. She failed because escape was never truly offered. Every path out required sacrificing the one thing she was taught she needed to survive, being wanted. And so she stayed wanted, admired, watched, and contained. This is why she couldn't escape. Not because she didn't see the cage, but because the cage was built to look like the only place she could live. And once a cage becomes identity, leaving it feels like erasing yourself. That is the quiet, final cruelty of her story. Not that Marilyn Monroe died, but that Norma Jean never had the chance to live free.